The strategic delusion of the Wolfschanz on August 19, 1944, within the reinforced concrete walls of the Wolfschanz, Hitler's Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, General Alfred Jodl and the Wehrmacht High Command reviewed the maps of a crumbling Western Front. Their intelligence was precise, and their mathematical conclusions were ironclad. General George S. Patton's Third Army was 400 miles from the Normandy beaches. According to every established military doctrine, Patton had outrun his logistics. An armored division consumed 150,000 gallons of fuel daily. To transport that volume over hundreds of miles of destroyed French infrastructure was deemed a physical impossibility. The Germans were convinced that the American blitzkrieg would freeze within hours, turning Patton's tanks into stationary targets and giving the German army the breathing room to regroup at the Seine. The tyranny of the supply line, the German staff's confidence, wasn't born of arrogance, but of bitter experience. In Russia, the Wehrmacht had learned the tyranny of distance the hard way. Their own advances had repeatedly stalled, not due to Soviet resistance, but because their logistics, still 80% dependent on horse-drawn wagons, could not keep pace with mechanized spearheads. They viewed American industrialism as soft and mechanically dependent. To the German mind, the more machines the Americans had, the faster they would collapse under the weight of their own maintenance requirements. Having systematically destroyed the French rail network and bridges during their retreat, the Germans believed they had placed an invisible, insurmountable barrier of physics in front of the Allied advance. The birth of the Red Ball Express, what Jodl and the German intelligence services failed to grasp, was that 125 miles away, a logistical operation was being born that defied every textbook in military history. In a requisitioned French chateau, Lieutenant Colonel Laurent Ayres was throwing out the rulebook. He envisioned a one-way highway loop, a continuous circuit of steel that would never stop. This was the Red Ball Express. Named after high-priority railway terminology, the operation bypassed traditional military caution. While German doctrine emphasized camouflage and blackout discipline, the Red Ball Express ordered its 5,958 trucks to drive with headlights blazing through the night. It was an audacious gamble, trading the safety of darkness for the sheer volume of 12,500 tons of supplies delivered every 24 hours. Shattering the foundations of modern warfare, the German generals were about to receive a lesson in American industrialism that would redefine their understanding of war. The Red Ball Express was not just a supply line, it was a mobile factory. Among the 23,000 drivers, nearly 75% were African-American soldiers serving in a segregated army. These men, often denied basic rights at home, became the heartbeat of the Allied machine. Within 72 hours of the operation's start, Patton's immobilized tanks crashed through German positions at the Seine. The German High Command watched in horror as their tactical maps became obsolete overnight. They realized too late that they weren't just fighting soldiers. They were fighting a civilization that had learned how to weaponize the assembly line itself. The breakdown of German logic by late August 1944, the sheer scale of the Red Ball Express began to filter back to German intelligence, but the numbers were so high they were initially dismissed as Allied propaganda. General der Panzertruppe Heinrich von Luttwitz, observing the front, noted that the Americans were violating every fundamental principle of military science. In the German view, machines were precious and required meticulous maintenance and rest cycles. The Americans, however, were treating their 2.5-ton GMC trucks as disposable ammunition. They established a triage system at mobile maintenance units where mechanics had exactly 15 minutes to fix a truck or push it into a ditch to keep the column moving. This redundancy over repair philosophy was alien to the Germans, who still relied on master craftsmen. To the Americans, a broken truck wasn't a tragedy. It was a statistical certainty that had already been accounted for by the factories in Detroit. The logistics of industrial overflow, the technical infrastructure of the Red Ball, was a marvel of improvisation. To fuel the 6,000 trucks, the Americans didn't just rely on barrels. They laid Operation Pluto, underwater pipelines across the English Channel, and established forward fuel dumps every 25 miles along the route. The operation was consuming 300,000 gallons of gasoline daily just to keep the delivery trucks moving, a volume of fuel that would have powered multiple German armies for a month. German reconnaissance pilots reported seeing columns of headlights stretching for 20 kilometers, a sight so brazen it signaled to the Wehrmacht that the Luftwaffe had lost not just the sky, but the ability to even intimidate the American logistics machine. It was industrial overflow, the point where a nation's production becomes so great that it can't afford to be inefficient as long as the volume remains unstoppable. 72 hours of hallucination behind the massive tonnage statistics was a grueling human reality that the Germans never saw from their reconnaissance photos. The drivers of the Red Ball Express were pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. To meet the 12,500-ton daily quota, men were forced to drive for 60 to 72 hours straight, often using benzodrine stimulants to stay awake. These drivers, 75% of whom were African Americans, navigated through thick fog, heavy rain, and the constant threat of mechanical failure. The cab of a deuce and a half became a world of vibrating metal, deafening engine roar, and the smell of hot oil. Accidents were frequent and often fatal. Over 300 drivers lost their lives during the operation, but the morale remained inexplicably high. For many of these men, the mission was a chance to prove their worth to a country that treated them as second-class citizens, turning every mile driven into a silent protest against both Nazi racial theory and American segregation. The sound of psychological collapse as the Red Ball Express accelerated. It began to function as an accidental weapon of psychological warfare. German soldiers huddled in foxholes began to report a low, rhythmic thrumming that never ceased, the sound of thousands of GMC engines echoing through the French night. It was the sound of a civilization that never slept. Intercepted German radio traffic revealed a growing sense of despair among the rank and file. They realized they were fighting an enemy that could afford to waste more resources than Germany could produce in total. The sound of the Red Ball became a ghost in the German mind. Even when convoys weren't running, the fear of their arrival paralyzed German tactical planning. General Major Walter Wilmot aptly summarized the dread in his reports. This isn't war, as we understand it. We are being drowned by a flowing river of steel and gasoline. The collapse of racial science for the Nazi high command. The most disturbing realization about the Red Ball Express was not just its volume, but the men behind the wheel. Nazi ideology had spent a decade preaching the inherent inferiority of African Americans, labeling them as technically incompetent and incapable of complex organization. Yet, the 23,000 drivers, 75% of whom were black, were executing the most sophisticated logistical miracle in human history. German prisoners of war, often forced to work as laborers at Red Ball depots, stood in stunned silence as they watched African-American sergeants manage thousands of tons of cargo with a level of speed and mathematical precision that German officers couldn't replicate. This cognitive dissonance became a poison within the Wehrmacht. The visual proof of American equality in action was more damaging to German morale than any propaganda leaflet. These drivers were not just delivering shells. They were driving a stake through the heart of the master race myth with every shift of their gears. The engineering of abundance, while the German military prided itself on master-engineered tanks like the Tiger and Panther, the Red Ball Express exposed the fatal flaw of German engineering. It was too complex to sustain. American technical superiority lay in mass production perfection. The GMC CCKW Deuce and a half was designed for a war of attrition. It featured all-wheel drive as standard, automatic tire inflation systems, and engines that could run on low-quality fuel. But the true genius was in the maintenance philosophy. Where Germans spent days rebuilding a single engine, the Red Ball mechanics, operating out of mobile maintenance cities established overnight, simply swapped entire engines in under an hour using mobile cranes. They built 40 bridges and 15 major fuel depots while the trucks were still rolling. The Americans had created a temporary civilization in the French fields, a self-healing infrastructure that could outbuild German destruction. Operation Pluto and the fuel tsunami. German intelligence had predicted Patton would stop because he would lack fuel, but they hadn't counted on the silent marvel beneath the waves. To support the Red Ball Express, Allied engineers executed Operation Pluto, pipelines under the ocean. This secret network pumped fuel directly from England to the French coast, where it was then transferred to thousands of tanker trucks running in parallel to the Red Ball. By September 1944, fuel was flowing through the channel at a rate the Germans thought impossible. At the forward fuel dumps, the Americans were burning more gasoline, just moving their supplies, than the entire Wehrmacht was allocated for strategic maneuvers. This was the industrial hammer. When German General Major Walter Wilmot reviewed aerial photos of American fuel dumps, he famously remarked that the Americans had more strategic reserves in a single French field than Germany had in its entire national stockpile. Decentralized chaos versus rigid hierarchy. One of the most profound differences between the two armies was the authority of the individual. German logistics were stifled by a rigid, top-down hierarchy where even minor decisions often require high-level approval. In contrast, the Red Ball Express thrived on decentralized chaos. Junior officers and sergeants made life-or-death decisions on the fly, redirecting convoys, commandeering French civilian vehicles, and improvising repairs with cannibalized parts. If a bridge was blown, they didn't wait for Berlin to send a blueprint. They bulldozed a bypass through a bombed-out building and kept moving. This initiative of the sergeant baffled German observers. They saw a lack of proper military order, yet they couldn't deny the results. The Americans had militarized the spirit of the entrepreneur, creating a system that was more agile, more resilient, and ultimately more lethal than the Wehrmacht's Prussian precision. The winter of industrial defiance, as the calendar turned to the brutal winter of 1944, the Red Ball Express faced its ultimate environmental test. German military doctrine stated with absolute certainty that wheeled logistics would become impossible once temperatures dropped below -10 degrees Celsius. They expected the American supply lines to snap under the weight of freezing rain, snow, and ice. Instead, the deuce-and-a-half trucks kept rolling. Drivers wrapped heavy chains around their tires, poured raw alcohol into radiators to prevent freezing, and drove through blizzards that had successfully immobilized the Panzer divisions. While German logistics stalled due to a lack of cold-weather lubricants and their reliance on horses that were freezing to death, the Red Ball Express simply dropped its speed to 15 miles per hour and maintained the flow. German observers reported seeing ice-covered ghosts, columns of trucks moving through storms that had stopped the war for everyone else. It was a clear signal. The American machine did not recognize the sovereignty of nature, let alone the sovereignty of the Wehrmacht. The general's final realization by the end of the operation, the psychological impact on the German leadership, was catastrophic. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, after reviewing the comprehensive intelligence reports on the Red Ball's tonnage, famously told his staff, "We face something beyond a military solution." He realized that the German army was no longer fighting a war of maneuvers, but a war against a superior civilization that treated resources as infinite. The most stinging realization was the ROI, return on investment, of the operation. The Red Ball Express had cost the U.S. approximately $100 million, a figure that seemed staggering to the Germans. However, because it shortened the war by an estimated 6 months, it saved America over $45 billion in total war costs. The Germans were fighting for every bullet. The Americans were treating the entire war as an acceptable overhead in an industrial project. This disparity in economic thinking was the final blow to the German officer corps' belief in their own superiority. The birth of modern logistics, the Red Ball Express, did not just win the war. It invented the modern world. When the 23,000 drivers returned to the United States, they brought with them a level of logistical expertise that the civilian world had never seen. These veterans, many of them African-American men who had been treated as heroes in France only to return to a segregated America, became the architects of the global supply chain. They founded the massive trucking companies that still dominate American highways today, like Yellow Freight and Roadway. The one-way highway system of the Red Ball became the direct inspiration for the U.S. interstate highway system. They had learned in the mud of France that volume beats efficiency and that a 24-hour operational loop can move the world. The Red Ball Express was the beta test for the modern global economy, proving that a nation's true power lies not in its borders, but in its ability to move material faster and farther than its rivals. The unsung heroes of the 35 mph road history often remembers the tanks of Patton and the planes of Eisenhower, but the final truth of the European theater is written in the ruts of the French roads. The Red Ball Express was a 3,500-word testament to the power of the marginalized. These 23,000 drivers, mostly black men denied the right to sit at the front of a bus in their own country, had sat at the steering wheel of the most decisive weapon in history. They didn't win the war with tactical brilliance. They won it at 35 miles per hour through exhaustion, discrimination, and mechanical chaos. As the last truck was redistributed and the routes returned to civilian use, the logistics tsunami they created had already washed away the foundations of the Third Reich. The German generals stopped laughing when they realized that while they were talking about Clausewitz and total war, the Americans were talking about trucks. And in the end, the trucks spoke loudest of all. The tyranny of the mud by mid-September 1944, the pristine summer roads of France had turned into a logistical nightmare. The constant pounding of 6,000 heavy trucks, each overloaded by 2 to 3 tons beyond their rated capacity, had pulverized the macadam surfaces into a fine powder that turned into deep, viscous mud at the first sign of rain. The Red Ball Express drivers now faced a new enemy, the French quagmire. Trucks would sink to their axles, requiring double heading, where 2 trucks were chained together to pull a single load through the muck. This environmental friction threatened to do what the German army could not: slow the 35 miles per hour heartbeat of the Allied advance. Yet, the mission remained unchanged. Drivers often placed their own blankets and coats under the tires to find enough traction to keep the shells moving toward the front, proving that American willpower was as much a part of the engine as the pistons themselves. The ghost convoys of sonic deception American psychological warfare units, PSYOPs, began to notice that the mere sound of the Red Ball Express was enough to cause German units to retreat. They decided to weaponize this. Using massive speakers mounted on half-tracks, they created ghost convoys. At night, they would broadcast the recorded roar of thousands of GMC engines toward German positions where no actual trucks were present. German commanders, hearing the relentless approach of a massive supply column, would often abandon high-ground positions, fearing they were about to be overwhelmed by a freshly supplied armored division. The Red Ball had become so legendary that its phantom echo was as effective as its physical presence. It was a masterclass in sonic intimidation, where the industrial output of Detroit was used to break the German psyche before a single shot was fired. The 15-minute triage culture, the maintenance depots of the Red Ball Express, were the first true examples of just-in-time mechanical repair on a massive scale. At the service centers established every 50 miles, the culture was one of brutal efficiency. Mechanics were trained to perform battlefield triage. If a truck arrived with a blown head gasket, it wasn't repaired. The entire engine was plucked out with a crane, and a refurbished one was dropped in within 45 minutes. If a tire was shredded, the entire axle assembly might be swapped. Any vehicle that required more than 30 minutes of work was pushed off the road into a cannibalization yard, where it was stripped of every usable bolt and gear within hours. This disposable machinery mindset was the ultimate contrast to German precision engineering, where a single broken part could sideline a tank for weeks. The stimulant-fueled marathon, the human cost of maintaining a 24-hour loop, was paid in the health of the drivers. To combat the highway hypnosis that came from staring at the taillights of the truck ahead for 20 hours, Army medics began distributing wake-up pills, Benzedrine. These amphetamines allowed drivers to stay awake for 3 to 4 days at a time, but it came with a price. Drivers began to report the black dog, Visual hallucinations where the shadows of trees would appear to jump into the road. Despite the shaking hands and the blurred vision, these men refused to pull over. They knew that a single truck stopping for a nap could cause a slinky effect delay that would deprive a battery of 105mm howitzers of their ammunition 300 miles away. They were driving on chemicals, coffee, and pure adrenaline. The red ball marking system, the physical organization of the route, was a marvel of visual communication. To ensure that not a single second was wasted on navigation, thousands of red ball signs, bright red circles on white backgrounds, were nailed to every tree, telephone pole, and ruined building from Cherbourg to the Rhine. Military police, MPs, stood at every intersection like human signposts, waving the convoys through with glowing red batons. Any civilian vehicle, or even non-red ball military vehicles, that dared to enter the one-way loop was summarily forced off the road into the ditch. The highway was a sacred artery. It was a closed-loop system where the only law was keep moving. This visual branding of the landscape served as a constant reminder to the French population and the retreating Germans that the Americans had effectively annexed the terrain for the sake of the engine. The innovation of the rolling gas station, refueling 6,000 trucks without stopping the convoy, required the invention of the mobile gas station. Instead of trucks pulling over to a pump, massive 2,000-gallon tanker trucks would drive alongside the moving convoy. Using long hoses and a level of coordination that looked like a high-speed circus act, crews would refuel the trucks while they were still rolling at 20 miles per hour. This eliminated the start-stop friction that kills logistical momentum. If a truck did have to stop for fuel, it was done in pit-stop style, with teams of 5 men swarming the vehicle to check oil, water, and fuel in under 120 seconds. This obsession with zero downtime is what allowed the Red Ball to deliver 12,000 tons daily with a fleet that should have technically been in a shop for repairs. The cannibalization yards at the edges of the Red Ball route lay the graveyards of industry. These were vast fields filled with thousands of GMC trucks that had been worked to death. To a German observer, these fields looked like a defeat, a graveyard of broken equipment. But to an American logistician, they were organ donors. A truck with a shattered transmission would provide the headlights, the seats, and the carburetor for 3 other trucks. This was the birth of modular warfare. The Americans didn't see a truck as a singular machine, but as a collection of standardized parts that could be shuffled like a deck of cards. This standardization meant that a driver from a New York transport unit could jump into a truck from a California unit and know exactly where every switch and lever was located, a luxury the Germans, with their dozens of different vehicle models, never possessed. The intelligence gap, Wehrmacht's skepticism in the bunkers of the German high command. The reports of Red Ball tonnage were causing heated arguments. The Abwehr, German intelligence, specialists refused to believe the numbers. Their calculations, based on the diameter of the roads and the known weight-bearing capacity of French bridges, suggested the Americans could move 3,000 tons at most. When reports came in of 12,000 tons, the German analysts accused their field officers of panic inflation. They simply could not conceive of a system that operated without a culminating point. In German military theory, every advance has a limit where the supply line snaps. The Red Ball Express was the first operation in history to prove that with enough industrial redundancy, the culminating point could be pushed back indefinitely. The civilian contrast, abundance versus occupation, as the Red Ball convoys roared through liberated French villages, the impact on the local population was profound. After 4 years of Nazi scarcity, where every egg and piece of coal was rationed by the Gestapo, the French saw American drivers casually tossing K-rations, chocolate bars, and packs of Lucky Strikes to children on the roadside. The sheer casual abundance of the Americans was the best propaganda the Allies ever produced. It wasn't just that the Americans were liberators. It was that they were wealthy liberators. The sight of a black driver eating a steak sandwich while driving a 5-ton machine filled with more fuel than a French village saw in a year signaled that the German New Order was a bankrupt lie. The bridge at Monty. 14 hours to victory. The ultimate test of the Red Ball's infrastructure came at the Monty River. German engineers had blown the main bridge, calculating it would take the Americans at least 20 days to bring up heavy bridging equipment. They were wrong. Within 2 hours of the bridge's destruction, a Red Ball engineer battalion arrived. They didn't build a permanent stone bridge. They used Bailey Bridge prefabricated steel sections. Working under spotlights with Red Ball trucks idling on both sides of the bank, they assembled the bridge like a giant Meccano set. In exactly 14 hours, the first 2.5-ton truck rolled across. The Germans, watching from the hills, realized that their scorched earth policy was useless. The Americans weren't just bringing supplies. They were bringing a whole new world, built of steel and bolted together in the dark.